What would happen if we stopped fixing churches and started seeing all the people that God has called us to reach? That was the question that launched the movement called See All the People. Good morning, Bishop. I'm sorry I didn't see you back there. God bless you. Good to see you. That was the question that launched the movement called See All the People. And it's interesting, when it first posed the question, had no idea that it would have such resonance with people across our connection, across our denomination. Also had no idea that it would have so much resonance with people in other denominations. So this movement has crossed past the borders of United Methodism, and there are other denominations who have grabbed hold of what it means to see all the people. This question was posed in an attempt to help our congregations to begin to focus outward, to be able to actively engage our communities. I believe that this question had such resonance because our anxious response to decades of decline in mainline denominations was to try and fix what is broken. And so we have turned inward, believing that if we just implement the right program, if we get just the right leadership structure, if we build that new playground for children, if we get the right worship praise band, if we do all of these things, fixing all of the broken parts of the church, that people will come. Now, I have to tell you that there is a dangerous seduction in trying to fix the church. I speak to you not only as the General Secretary of Discipleship Ministries, but I also speak to you as a person who pastored a local church for 25 years. I was a new church start planter in California and pastored a large church, multi-site campus in Wichita, Kansas. And as it just so happens, I am serving, Bishop, in an interim role as a pastor in Nashville, Tennessee, although on a limited basis. But I have to say to you that when I first started this role as an interim, the people said, "Well, we have some musician issues we need to focus on. Can you help us with our budget issues? Can you help us realign the structure of our church?" And I actually planned a full day leadership summit, a full day of tackling and diving into these very issues. And I woke up early on that Saturday morning, and God was speaking to my spirit and said, "No, this is what you've been talking about. This is the seduction to focus on fixing the church and to avoid the work of making disciples, particularly engaging our community." The problem with the focus internally only on fixing the church was captured perfectly by Mike Breen, who said, "If you try to build the church, you will rarely get disciples. But if you make disciples, you will always get the church." If you try to build the church, you will rarely get disciples. But if you make disciples, you will always get the church. So we shifted gears in this particular local church. I said, we're not going to focus internally. We're going to focus on our plan to engage the community and to see all of the people. Now, it didn't change the issues that were there internally, but it's amazing to me that just by beginning to focus externally, that the things that were broken internally, they now are kind of taking care of themselves. And people are giving attention to those things, but with a different focus. The different focus is on we are engaging our community. And as we engage our community and provide a place of welcome and radical hospitality, these are some things, right, that we also give attention to within the life of the congregation. Now, I don't want to minimize the moment that we find ourselves in, the cultural moment that we find ourselves in, the socioeconomic, the political environment that we find ourselves in. I mean, engaging the community is a very difficult thing to do in times like these. Very, very difficult. We are ministering in some very interesting and difficult times. There are a lot of questions about the future. There's a lot of uncertainty. There's a lot of anxiety. There's a lot of mistrust. None of us were trained to minister in this environment. The late Peter Drucker was often quoted as saying that we are in one of those great historical periods that occur every 200 to 300 years when people don't understand the world anymore and the past is not sufficient to explain the future. We live in a generation that has lost faith in the ability of social and religious institutions to make the world a better place. And yet, these are the people that God has called us to reach. I want to submit to you today that the foundation for helping churches to engage the community is really helping them to rediscover their why. That we cannot talk about engaging the community without also talking about intentional discipleship. We cannot talk about engaging the community without being intentional about the type and kinds of disciples we are making and how they are formed. And so we have to ensure that there is clarity about the what and the how of all the things that we do, particularly in a local church setting. And we do great things in local churches. Local churches do outreach programs well. Feeding programs, thrift stores, clothing drives, neighborhood cleanups, after-school programs, all of these sort of things. But the problem is that too many times we have forgotten the why we are doing them. And too often, many churches have no idea about how all of these activities, events, and programs connect back to our mission of making disciples of Jesus Christ for the transformation of the world. I often ask churches these questions like, tell me, what does your church do? You ever ask, what does your church do? And you get a long list of activities, but rarely has a church said, we make disciples. We're doing many good things in local churches, but we've forgotten the why. And so we have to rediscover the why of making disciples and to have a clear understanding about how everything we do in our ministries is contributing to fulfilling the mission of the church. One of the most impactful experiences I've had in the last couple of years was to travel to Seoul, South Korea, and participated in a vital church immersion experience, to be on church in Seoul, South Korea. And as a part of that experience, we heard lectures from pastors and lay teams about their churches. These are the fastest growing churches in the world. And of course, so how are these churches growing? And can I tell you, in every presentation, this is what struck me. In every presentation, they began with, this is how we make disciples in the life of this congregation. And they knew exactly how every outreach effort tied back to the process of making disciples. As a matter of fact, everything they did in the community was considered a first step into an intentional system of discipleship. So engaging the community was the big front porch. It was the first step of inviting people into relationship. I want to submit to you that vital congregations are effective in disciple making, not because they have some magical formula, not because they have discovered some secret sauce, not because they've read the book about how to grow your church to 1,000 in 30 days, not because they have implemented the latest surefire program, a can't miss new program. They are vital and vibrant because their leaders know their why and they stay connected to their why. And they understand and can clearly articulate the core process of their local church that leads people to Christ, grows people to spiritual maturity, equips people for ministry, and empowers people to share their faith with others. That's a core process. Now, in the United Methodist Church tradition, that's paragraph 122, right? That's the core process. That's the intentional system of making disciples. In a 100 Movements article by Alan Hirsch, he talked about movement killers. And he quotes Stephen Addison, who is a missiologist who spent much of his professional life studying Christian movements. And he said the key to the success of Methodism was the high level of commitment to the Methodist cause that was expected of participants. And he says that the cause declined to the degree that the movement had moved away from its original missional ethos of evangelism and disciple making. This is the original missional ethos of evangelism and disciple making, and degenerated into mere religious legalism maintained by institution, rule books, and highly professionalized clergy. And he named two killers of movements: heightened educational requirements. With all due respect for those who are students here, it's a good thing. God bless you. But the second, which is relevant to this discussion, lowered discipleship focus. So that by 1860, we no longer required classes and bands. Discipleship had become an optional extra. Methodism has been in decline in relation to the percentage of the population ever since. I was talking about Bishop Farr about this, and he was saying to me, like, in the early days of classes and bands, that was the first step into a church's discipleship system. As a matter of fact, that to get to worship, right, participation in the weekly class was the requirement in order to go to worship. Now, that may seem archaic to you, but I would humbly submit to you that it really does still work. In my city, there's a church that's pastored, co-pastored by C.C. Winans and Bishop Love, and I had dinner with them, and we're talking about this church. And this church is really about 6 years old. It's not a United Methodist church. This church is about 6 years old. But there's a story behind this. It's not a United Methodist church. We had dinner, and then we had some other conversations. Then one they wanted to talk about intentional discipleship, engaging the community. And as I continue to have conversation with them, I said, well, I don't think you guys need what we have to offer, because I think you understand what you are doing. This church is about 6 years old. They are averaging about 350 in worship every Sunday, but they have never done one single bit of advertising, marketing, any word campaign. It's started as a Bible study by their son, who was a student at Belmont University, in their living room. And as they were studying in this Bible study group in their living room, these young people said, we would like to reach more people. And so they started another Bible study. And then they started another small group, and then another small group, and then another small group. And then after a year, now this church is finally, we probably need to start worshiping. And then they started a worship experience. And the last time I was at the church, I started just talking to people who were a part of the congregation. And I was surprised that I met a person who said, this is actually my first time attending worship here, but I've been a part of a small group for over a year. I didn't even know that C.C. Winans was a part of this congregation. And that's amazing to me, right? But the emphasis is on discipleship. It's on intentional discipleship as a way of introducing and bringing people into relationship. And so we cannot effectively make disciples who transform the world without discerning, well, what is the missional ethos of evangelism and disciple making for the 21st century church in our context? So we need a new ethos of disciple making for the 21st century church, an intentional system of discipleship in every local church. And with that understanding as a backdrop, the question on the floor, well, then is how do we effectively engage the community? Specifically, how do we engage people who are non-religious and are people who claim no religious affiliation, church affiliation, denominational affiliation, and are consider the church just to be irrelevant? That the basic principle behind see all the people movement is this, that we cannot disciple people that we are not in relationship with. Amen. In Antoine de Saint-Exupéry's book Citadel, he describes the process of a group of people building a boat. I'll give you the paraphrase. He says, if you want to build a ship, don't drum up the men and women to gather wood, divide the work, and give orders. Instead, teach them to yearn for the vast and endless sea. My grandmother described this yearning as having a burden for the people. She was a faithful Methodist who passionately believed in Jesus until her death. She died at 99 years old. And she served in many positions of leadership inside the church, but she never quit believing that the love of Christ could transform lives and communities. She was a school teacher in the Houston Independent School District. And my grandmother also served as my first superintendent of Vacation Bible School. And she just had a way of practicing contextualized ministry before we even knew what contextualized ministry was. She had a way of connecting what we were learning, the stories, what we were learning, with a vast desire to share these stories and what we were feeling and experiencing with others, as she would describe, for those who were yet to come. When we talk about engaging the communities, part of that responsibility as leaders is to help people find and embrace a vision that is rooted in a deep love for all of God's children, not unlike a love and a yearning for the vast and endless sea. And I believe such a love pulls us forward, gives us the courage and the willingness to go wherever God leads us. Jesus said to his disciples in Matthew 9, the harvest is plentiful, but the laborers are few. Therefore, ask the Lord of the harvest to send out the laborers into the harvest. Friends, the harvest is still plentiful. And today, unlike the time of Jesus, people still have deep spiritual needs and they long for greater meaning in their lives. And in order to engage the community with integrity, we must see the people that God calls us to reach not as a means to an end, not as a pawn in our strategic plan, not as a way to simply increase our capacity as a local church to pay our bills or even simply fill the pews. If sharing the love and the grace of God with people is our why, that's the Great Commission, right? If that is our why, go back to that. If that is our why, then the relationships with people, the Great Commandment, becomes our how. Engagement is more than the church invite, right? So we're not talking about simply new ways to invite people to church. We're not talking about the new creative ways to do that. We're talking about a different type of engagement. The kind of intimacy required for this type of missional ethos or evangelistic ethos is more personal and ultimately more effective, but it is infinitely more difficult. It will require more of us. It will frustrate those of us who are yearning for quick and expecting quick results. But this critical work requires reservoirs of spiritual stamina that we cannot forget. But we cannot forget that it was in this context of seeing the people that Jesus reminds us through prayer of our call to engage our community. See all the people. In my travels to Johannesburg, South Africa, that was a greeting I learned. It was called Sawubona. Sawubona. See, I literally means I see you. It's a greeting that's practiced particularly in the northern NATO tribes. I see you. The traditional response to a Sawubona is Yebo Sawubona, which means yes, I see you too. Let's practice that. I'll say Sawubona. Your response will be Yebo Sawubona. Sawubona. Yes, I see you too. Seeing is a dialogue. It is an invitation to participate in another's life. I see you means that I acknowledge the dignity of your existence. I see you means that I acknowledge that you were created in the image of God. People want to be seen and valued. This is the basis for effectively engaging the community. The church does not undertake outreach to provide ministry for people, but rather to be in ministry and a relationship with people. Now, some churches have outreach that's missionally focused. And I mentioned some of these earlier, right? Like feeding programs, those sort of things. Some churches have outreach that's more evangelistically focused. Like they'll, at a local a church event or a local community event, they'll do water bottles with the brand of the church and they'll go pass out water bottles. So things like that to kind of help get the word out about who they are. Whether a church's outreach is missional or evangelistic in nature, what I'm suggesting to you is that its effectiveness, the effectiveness depends upon it being intentionally designed with engagement and relationship building in mind. In other words, outreach has to get married to intentional discipleship. Building relationships and engaging the community must be seen as part of an intentional discipleship system. I'm amazed. I do a lot of coaching and consulting, and I've traveled and been in a lot of places, a lot of churches, met with a lot of pastors, worked with a lot of leadership teams. I'm always amazed at churches who will have outstanding outreach programs and be ministering to a lot of people, but couldn't even tell you the name of people who are walking through their doors every week that they're ministering to. Right? There's a difference in ministering to and ministering with. Outreach must get married to intentional discipleship. Engagement involves initiating and building relationships. In other words, the mission field, which would be a church's defined community, becomes the primary focus of attention and resources of a particular local church instead of directing the majority of our attention and resources to maintenance. A focus on building relationships will force a church to address the unique contextual needs of its community instead of depending on standardized programs. This is the work of leadership. Now, there are two dimensions to effective engagement. The first is personal, and personal is our personal influence, our personal witness with people in our circle of influence, right? Our personal witness. Now, for those of you who are United Methodists and members of the United Methodist Church, and you entered into a thing called the membership covenant. And part of the membership covenant is your agreement, you covenant to do five things. So you probably know these by heart, right? I'm a promise to support the church through my prayers, my presence, my gifts, my service, and my witness, right? This is the personal dimension of engaging the community. Right? This is our personal witness, right? And this begins with relationships. The corporate aspect is everything a church does to provide opportunities for people to develop relationships with people who are currently outside of the church. So let me say a word first about the personal dimension of this. There is no substitute for personal relationships. I mean, there is no substitute for a personal witness. Now, I'm not talking about hitting people upside the head with a Bible saying "be saved." I'm not talking about going through a track on the 5 laws to conversion. I'm talking about having authentic relationships with people. And when you are in authentic relationships with people, there are just natural, organic opportunities for people to be able to ask questions and for the opportunities for people to be able to share their faith. But we have to have some spiritual sensitivity to when those moments arise in people's lives or in the lives of the people that we are in relationship with. When Jesus talked about discipleship, he wasn't teaching people how to invite people to a service at the synagogue. He was talking about discipleship in the cultural context of Greek culture influencing the Roman Empire through the power of discipleship. He was talking about the impact of discipleship on culture. And because in our context, particularly in American Christianity, we think only corporate, not personal. We compartmentalize or privatize our faith, and too many of us never take our faith public. But that's what discipleship is. It's taking our faith public. There's a church in Nashville called Mount Zion, and I like learning from churches, particularly churches that are outside of our tribe. And this is a church that has 3 campuses, and it's really the third campus is really an old building they used to worship in. They no longer worship there, but it's in a very strategic a part of the city of Nashville, right there in the heart of Vanderbilt. And they kept it there for strategic purposes because, again, it's located right there. And one of my leadership practices is to regularly meet with community leaders to learn, to network, to build relationships, to be stretched. And when I first got to Nashville, I asked my admin, would you call Bishop Walker, let him know I would like to have lunch with him. She calls Bishop, and Bishop says, yeah, tells you I want to have lunch with him, but I want him to attend my Wednesday noon Bible study. And then after the Wednesday noon Bible study, I'm going to take him to lunch. And then he says something to her that really shocked me. He said, and tell him that I'm going to reserve a parking spot for him. Reserve a parking spot for me on Wednesday, noon, Bible study. Can I tell you, when I showed up at Wednesday at noon, there were police officers directing traffic to get people into that sanctuary. And it was a 50-minute experience. And I walk in, and this place is filled with people from, a lot of students, but a lot of people from the medical profession. There were doctors, nurses, tech folk, tight service, singing, teaching was the highlight. And then there was an intentional invitation to discipleship. So I got to lunch with Bishop and said, tell me how you do this. I mean, how did this happen? What's going on? What's the strategy here? And he says, it's about the personal dimension of engaging the community. So we empower people to strategically hang out. In other words, we empower people to remember that they are in relationships of influence and that God uses people in relationships. And there are opportunities for invitation. And so they use their power of influence to invite people to this experience as a first step into discipleship. How do they do this? Here's an example. So they will send out like a text that says, hey, learn the purpose of grace. And then it reads, instead of taking your coworker to lunch, bring them to noon Bible study. And the covenant that person makes with their coworker is after that experience on another day to go buy their lunch and then to unpack everything they've heard on that Wednesday. That's the power of personal discipleship. Right? Now, because discipleship begins with me, that's one of the principles we teach in intentional discipleship. I would ask you a question, right? As a leader, as a believer in Christ, where What type of relationships are you in with people who are currently outside of the church? An effective system of discipleship must have at its foundation persons who are growing in Christ and also learning how to personally witness on behalf of Christ. That's the personal aspect. Let me turn to the corporate. The corporate, if you remember, includes everything a church will do to provide opportunities for people to develop relationships with people who are currently outside the church. Part of my ministry journey in the United Methodist Church, when we had a two-tier ordination process, I was ordained a deacon in the Central Texas Conference, and I was ordained an elder in the California Nevada Annual Conference. And I was a student. I started seminary at Perkins School of Theology in Dallas. I was recruited to California. And one of the reasons why I agreed to move to California was because when I was meeting with this district superintendent, he said to me, but one day our annual conference is going to start a church. And he said, that could possibly be you. I was intrigued. Like, I would love the opportunity to be able to go plant a congregation. So I went. And for 4 years, I served as an associate pastor. And the time finally came for me to go plant a new church. And when I was asked to do this by then Bishop Melvin Talbert, the church did not have a name. Right? And so we were at annual conference, Bishop, in an annual conference, the appointments are read every year at an annual conference. And when they're read at annual conference, it'll say the name of the person, the church, and the city. For instance, Steve Spencer, Jones Memorial, San Francisco. Dale Weatherspoon, First Church, Palo Alto. And when he got to my name, he said, Junius Dotson, City of San Jose. I was appointed to the whole city, right? But what a helpful way to think about ministry and engaging the community, right? We didn't have Path One or there was not a whole lot by way of new church start training when we started Genesis. And the most effective training I received was actually in another discipline. I was trained as a community organizer. And the basic premise of community organizing is building relationships, bringing people together and using and leveraging those relationships for people to make progress on the issues that they care about. So I took that same concept and applied it as a way to begin to engage the community, right? The community in the Silicon Valley. Just started meeting people, right? One-to-ones. And then about 40, 50 one-to-ones in about 20 days, right? That's all one-to-ones. And that relationship led to another relationship, which led to another relationship, which led to another relationship, which led to another relationship. And this is how the process of starting that particular church emerged. But it gave me a principle for engaging the community about initiating and building relationships and bringing people together. What I learned in that experience, what I learned at St. Mark in Wichita when we started a second campus, what I learned and am learning now in Nashville as a general secretary of discipleship ministries in my travels across the connection, and what I've learned and am learning just as a resident who is brand spank new to a city, the city of Nashville, never lived there, have no family there. What I have learned is how important relationships are and the power of relationships. And the power of connecting to people in these ways. The central task of community organizing is connecting with people, building relationships. Now, here's the principle behind that. Every church had a beginning, right? Every church started somewhere, and people came together. And guess what? The question they asked was, how do we connect with people? How do we invite people to Christ? How do we move people into a relationship? And as they did that and people began to come, they started to create systems. Systems to do what? Systems to worship, systems to welcome, systems to disciple people. And so when you think about it from that perspective, the foundation, if you go to a church and the church has an annual fall whatever, and they've been having this annual fall whatever since the last, since the Mississippi was a creek. Well, you know why? Because at some point somebody thought this would be a good idea, a good way to connect with people in the community. So part of rediscovering that why is also recovering the DNA of connecting with one's local community. Are y'all still with me? So that is part of the foundation for effectively building relationships. So when I think about this from a corporate perspective, if you would think about a church that would plan any type of event or activity, if you would think about any outreach program a church currently does, I think there are three characteristics that are important in the corporate aspect of engaging a community, right? These three characteristics of this, that opportunity must provide opportunities for the development of relationships that are authentic, organic, and consistent. Right? This is the corporate aspect. First, relationships must be authentic, that engaging others in ways that build relationships can only be done when we are vulnerable and open to how God's spirit and grace will move through these encounters. People won't care how much you know until they know how much you care. People want to be known, and they want to know that we care. I want to dispel any myth that people no longer want to hang out in community. That's a myth. And it's a myth because I know it firsthand now. I know it firsthand in my experience to a brand new city and living in a building. And this is in a high-rise building. And I'm in a building, and it's amazing to me. Somebody could put up a sign that says, "Meet me in this room. We're gonna watch TV together. Or meet me in this room. We're gonna play games together." And the place is packed. Why? Because people have a desire to be in community with each other and in relationships. And I've discovered these organic groups that are emerging across the city, right? Now, no one should outdo relationships. Nobody can do better relationships than we do as a church. Right? This is part of thinking of our approach to how we effectively engage the community. So we have to create opportunities where there can be authentic connection. We can be vulnerable and connect with people. Second, opportunities for relationships to be organic. So we have to be open to the fact that God can use others to bring a blessing to us, to speak into our lives, right? And maybe to even meet some of our needs. We must not come with the idea that we're only bringing something to somebody, giving something to somebody. And in the local church context, we can provide opportunities to connect with our neighbors in ways, again, that build authentic community. Shared this yesterday with the group in the workshop. We're more of a workshop setting yesterday. I was talking about this one of these activities, right? One of these connect events, like a community block party, and going door to door, doing a prayer walk. And in a prayer walk, going door to door, just knocking on doors and introducing ourselves and connecting with people and just simply saying, "Hey, we're your neighbors. Is there anything that we can pray with you about? Would you like for us to share your prayer, with our prayer team? Would you like to share any more information with us? Would you like to be involved in planning an event to help meet more of your neighbors?" You'd be surprised at how people respond to the opportunity to do just that. And then moving to a community block party, creating those opportunities where there are people there who are not assigned to do work, who are not assigned to set up or take down or serve. The only responsibility is to connect with the community, right? To build relationships that are authentic, organic. That those things emerge in an organic kind of way. A few months ago, our agency did a See All the People challenge. And we did this challenge across the connection. We got all these interests, and people started sending in things that they were doing creatively. And by the way, when you go to seeallthepeople.org, you see a library of intentional discipleship systems, and you also see this library of creative ways that people are engaging the community. And there was this church called Radcliffe United Methodist Church in the Radcliffe, Kentucky area, and they sent this entry in called Mac Church, right? Mac Church, wow. And if we looked at their video, we read their plan. This small congregation had discovered the heart of missional engagement, particularly when it can happen in organic ways, when we are in authentic relationships. Right? They made a conscious choice to engage the community, and it did not start with the pastor. It started with one of the laypersons who just had a heart, right? A heart for off-shift workers, right? Off-shift workers usually work in the evenings, nights, weekends, make it harder for them to attend church activities and those sort of things. So he just had a heart for off-shift workers and wanting to connect with them. So he went to McDonald's, right? And it started with one person with a Bible study. But then that person invited another person, and then another person, and then another person. And this has grown into a small community where they do Bible study, communion, and in their video, even a baptism at McDonald's, right? Because they had a heart for engaging the community. The third thing is we have to be consistent, right? So we have to be, must be the posture of the body of Christ, the posture of a local church body, not a one-time thing, but it's something we do consistently, right? And I believe in a world that is so transactional, people appreciate those who offer love in consistent, non-transactional ways. I am convinced that people in this generation are not simply persuaded to Christ, they are attracted to Christ. They're not argued into the kingdom, but they are drawn by the love of God when we model and communicate in visibly consistent ways. And when leaders begin to make the shift from fixing churches to intentional discipleship and engaging our community, well, I believe our churches will be on a path that is future focused and mission driven. Thank you.